15th October 1958. Vinča Institute of Nuclear Sciences, 11 kilometers from Belgrade. A Tuesday morning shift, routine by all accounts. In the heavy water laboratory, technicians prepare for a scheduled experiment involving subcritical assembly manipulation. The RA research reactor, Yugoslavia's pride, hums in the adjacent building, background only. At 10:45, 6 men gather around a cylindrical tank containing uranium rods submerged in heavy water. The procedure: withdraw control rods manually, measure neutron flux, record data. Standard protocol, performed dozens of times. Dosimeters clipped to lab coats. No alarms yet. What the men do not know: the geometry has changed since yesterday's session. One configuration adjustment, unmeasured. At 10:47, neutron counters spike, not gradually, but instantaneously. A blue flash fills the room for less than 1 second, the Cherenkov radiation. In that instant, invisible and silent, 6 bodies absorb more radiation than a month of chest X-rays delivers. The readings that follow will rewrite Yugoslavia's nuclear safety protocols and end one man's life. The Vinča Institute of Nuclear Sciences opened its doors in 1953, built on marshland beside the Danube River, downstream from Belgrade. By 1956, the facility had become the centerpiece of Yugoslavia's civilian nuclear program, a symbol of scientific independence from both Moscow and Washington. Marshal Tito's Yugoslavia walked a careful line between East and West, and the nuclear research program reflected that balance. Soviet-designed reactors, Western instrumentation, Yugoslav ambition. The RA reactor, Research Reactor A, achieved first criticality on 11th October 1956. A heavy water-moderated natural uranium-fueled system rated at 6.5 megawatts thermal. It was modest by superpower standards, but represented a significant achievement for a nation of 18 million. The reactor served multiple purposes: isotope production for medicine and industry, neutron activation analysis, training for nuclear engineers, and fundamental research into reactor physics. By 1958, the facility employed over 400 staff: physicists, engineers, technicians, administrative personnel, and support workers. The reactor operated under the supervision of the Federal Nuclear Energy Commission, which reported directly to the Yugoslav government. Safety protocols existed, modelled partly on Soviet standards, partly on guidelines shared through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which Yugoslavia had joined in 1957. The heavy water laboratory occupied a separate building adjacent to the main reactor hall. Here, researchers conducted subcritical experiments, assemblies of fissile material designed to approach but never reach self-sustaining chain reactions. These experiments explored neutron behavior, tested fuel configurations, and trained operators in reactor physics. The work required precision, too little moderation, and neutron multiplication remained insignificant. Too much and criticality could occur unexpectedly. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, served as both moderator and reflector in these assemblies. Unlike ordinary water, heavy water absorbs very few neutrons, making it an excellent medium for sustaining nuclear reactions with natural uranium. The Vinča laboratory used cylindrical aluminum tanks, typically 60 to 80 centimeters in diameter and 100 to 150 centimeters tall, containing natural uranium rods arranged in lattice patterns and submerged in heavy water. Standard procedure called for gradual approach to criticality. Insert fuel rods incrementally, measure neutron multiplication at each step, calculate how close the assembly sits to the critical threshold. Control rods, cadmium or boron, strong neutron absorbers, remain inserted until measurements confirm safe geometry. Only then do operators withdraw control elements, monitoring neutron flux continuously. On 14th October, the day before the accident, the heavy water laboratory completed a successful subcritical experiment. The logbook entry, timed at 1600 hours, noted, assembly configuration stable, neutron multiplication factor estimated at 0.95, control rods withdrawn per protocol, experiment concluded, tank drained, fuel rods removed for reconfiguration. The next session was scheduled for the following morning. The 6 men who gathered in the heavy water laboratory on the morning of 15th October represented the core of Vinča's operational expertise. Zdravko Savanovic, 32 years old, senior reactor operator with 5 years' experience at the facility. Dusan Roksandic, physicist, age 29, specialist in neutron flux measurement. Živojin Iliev, 35, mechanical engineer responsible for fuel handling equipment. Dragoljub Tanaskovic, 27, junior technician in his second year at Vinča. Milan Majic, 41, health physics technician assigned to monitor radiation safety during experiments. Radivoj Kozachanin, 38, laboratory supervisor overseeing the morning's work. All 6 wore standard protective equipment, cotton lab coats, rubber gloves, safety glasses, and film badge dosimeters clipped near the collar. The dosimeters, small black plastic holders containing photographic film sensitive to ionizing radiation, would provide the only objective measure of what occurred in the next 3 minutes. The morning began with a briefing at 0930 hours. Kozachanin reviewed the day's objective: measure neutron multiplication in a reconfigured uranium heavy water assembly. The fuel rods had been repositioned the previous afternoon. Same total mass of uranium, different geometric arrangement intended to increase neutron coupling between rods. Calculations suggested the new configuration would yield a multiplication factor near 0.98, approaching but not reaching unity, the threshold of criticality. At 1000 hours, the team entered the heavy water laboratory. The aluminum tank sat in the center of the room, partially filled with heavy water from the previous day's work. Uranium rods, each approximately 3 centimeters in diameter and 1 meter long, clad in aluminum, were already positioned in the lattice holders inside the tank. 2 cadmium control rods remained fully inserted, penetrating the assembly from above. Standard procedure called for filling the tank completely with heavy water, while control rods remained in place, then withdrawing the control rods incrementally while monitoring neutron detectors positioned around the tank. Each withdrawal step, typically 5 to 10 centimeters, would be followed by several minutes of observation, allowing neutron population to stabilize and operators to record multiplication data. The team worked methodically. Savanovic operated the control rod mechanism, a manual screw-driven system. Roksandic monitored the neutron counters, boron trifluoride detectors connected to electronic scalers that counted neutron-induced pulses. Iliev managed the heavy water filling system. Tanaskovic recorded data in the experiment logbook. Majic held a portable survey meter, monitoring ambient radiation levels. Kozachanin supervised, cross-checking procedures against the written protocol. By 10:40, the tank was filled to the operating level, 120 centimeters of heavy water covering the uranium lattice. The control rods remained fully inserted. Neutron background count rate, approximately 50 counts per second, consistent with cosmic rays and reactor hall background. Savanovic prepared to begin the first control rod withdrawal. The logbook entry, in Tanaskovic's handwriting, reads, 10:42, heavy water level confirmed. Background count rate nominal. Beginning control rod withdrawal sequence. Observer, D. Roksandic. Operator, Z. Savanovic. No entry follows. What happened in the next 5 minutes remains partially reconstructed from testimony given hours and days later, when the men could speak, and from physical evidence, instrument readings, material positions, and the biological effects that began manifesting within hours. At 10:45, Savanovic began withdrawing the first control rod. Standard practice called for slow, incremental movement, 5 centimeters, pause, observe, record. The screw mechanism required approximately 20 seconds per 5 centimeter increment. Roksandic watched the neutron counter, calling out values as they climbed. 60 counts, 80, 110. Normal behavior for a subcritical assembly approaching criticality. Neutron multiplication increases as control rods withdraw, but the increase should be smooth, predictable, manageable. The operators had performed this procedure dozens of times. At approximately 10:47, exact time uncertain because no one was watching the clock, something changed. Roksandic later testified, the count rate jumped, not gradually. It went from perhaps 150 to several thousand in less than 2 seconds. I shouted. Savanovic tried to reverse the control rod, but there was no time. The neutron detectors saturated, overloaded beyond their measurement range. The blue flash occurred simultaneously. Cherenkov radiation, the optical signature of charged particles moving through a medium faster than light travels in that medium. In this case, beta particles and gamma-induced electrons moving through heavy water and tissue at relativistic speeds. The flash lasted less than 1 second, described by survivors as bright blue filling the room, visible even through closed eyelids. The physics of what occurred. The uranium heavy water assembly reached prompt criticality, a condition where neutron multiplication happens so rapidly that the population doubles in microseconds rather than seconds. In a controlled reactor, delayed neutrons emitted seconds or minutes after fission, provide time for control systems to respond. In prompt criticality, the chain reaction outpaces all control mechanisms. Power rises exponentially until physical effects, thermal expansion, steam formation, fuel displacement, disrupt the geometry and shut down the reaction. The Vinci criticality lasted approximately 80 milliseconds. In that interval, the assembly generated an energy burst estimated at 6 × 10 to the 15th fissions, roughly 80 megajoules of energy, equivalent to 20 kilograms of TNT. Most of that energy remained in the heavy water as heat. A small fraction emerged as penetrating gamma and neutron radiation. The 6 men stood within 3 meters of the assembly. Savanovich and Roksandich, operating the controls and watching the detectors, stood closest, perhaps 1.5 meters from the tank wall. Maric, with the survey meter, stood slightly farther. Kozachanin, supervising, was near the door, approximately 3 meters distant. All 6 received acute, whole-body radiation doses far exceeding safe limits. The immediate physical sensation? None. Radiation at these energies produces no heat, no pain, no sound. The blue flash? Yes, but no warning from the body itself. The minutes following the criticality unfolded in confusion, urgency, and improvisation. No alarm sounded. The facility had no automatic criticality detection system in the laboratory, only in the main reactor hall. The neutron detectors, saturated and damaged by the pulse, provided no useful information. Magic's survey meter, set to measure normal background levels, had overloaded and shut down. But the men knew. Savanovich later described the immediate aftermath. We understood what had happened. The blue light meant Cherenkov radiation. We had been taught about criticality, accidents in training, Chalk River in Canada, Los Alamos in America. We knew we had been exposed. The question was, how much? Kozachanin, as laboratory supervisor, made the first decision: evacuate the room immediately. The 6 men exited the heavy water laboratory at approximately 10:48, walking quickly but not running. Panic serves no purpose, and none yet felt physically ill. They proceeded to the health physics office, 300 meters across the Vinci complex. The health physics supervisor, a physician named Dr. Pavle Trajkovic, was on duty. He later reported, 6 men entered my office at approximately 10:50. They were agitated but coherent. Kozachanin explained, criticality accident in the heavy water lab, approximately 5 minutes ago. I immediately collected their dosimeter badges and ordered them to remain in the anteroom while I developed the films. Film badge dosimeters require chemical development, like photographic film, before exposure can be assessed. The process takes 30 to 45 minutes. While the films developed, Trajkovic conducted preliminary examinations. Pulse, blood pressure, visible injuries. All 6 appeared physically normal. No burns, no obvious trauma. But Trajkovic understood the implications. If a criticality had occurred, internal damage, cellular destruction in bone marrow, intestinal lining, and other rapidly dividing tissues, was already underway, invisible. At 1100 hours, Trajkovic telephoned the Federal Nuclear Energy Commission office in Belgrade, reporting a possible criticality accident at Vinci, with 6 personnel exposed. The Commission representative requested immediate transport of the exposed individuals to the Military Medical Academy in Belgrade for specialized treatment. By 11:15, the first dosimeter films were developed. Trajkovic later wrote in his report, Film badge 247B, assigned to Zdravko Savanovich, showed complete blackening, overexposure beyond the badge's measurement range, which extended to 400 Röntgens. Similar overexposure was observed in the badges assigned to Roksandich and Majic. Lesser, but still significant exposure appeared in the badges assigned to Iliev, Tanaskovic, and Kozacharnin. The badges provided only rough estimates. Complete blackening indicated exposure exceeding 400 Röntgens, but not by how much. Later dosimetric reconstruction, based on neutron activation of metal objects the men carried, belt buckles, wristwatches, coins, would provide better estimates. But, in those first hours, the medical team worked with incomplete information. At 11:45, an ambulance arrived from Belgrade. All 6 men were transported to the Military Medical Academy, arriving at 12:30. They walked from the ambulance to the hospital entrance under their own power. None had yet begun vomiting. The first symptom of acute radiation syndrome typically appears within 2 to 6 hours of exposure. The Military Medical Academy in Belgrade possessed Yugoslavia's only facility equipped to treat acute radiation injuries. The hospital had consulted with Soviet specialists in the aftermath of earlier radiation accidents in the USSR and had established protocols based on international medical literature, including reports from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies. Dr. Dragan Đurić, chief of hematology, took charge of the 6 patients. His first step: draw blood samples from each man at 1300 hours, approximately 2.5 hours post-exposure. These baseline samples would provide critical data. White blood cell counts, particularly lymphocyte populations, decline rapidly after radiation exposure. The rate and extent of decline correlate directly with dose received. Initial blood work showed lymphocyte counts still within normal range, expected given the short time elapsed. But Đurić ordered repeat sampling every 6 hours, knowing the counts would begin falling soon. He also ordered chromosome analysis. Radiation damages DNA, producing visible breaks and rearrangements in chromosomes that can be quantified under a microscope. By 1400 hours, 3 of the 6 men, Savanovic, Roksandich, and Majic, began experiencing nausea. Vomiting commenced shortly after. Đurić noted in the medical record, onset of nausea 2 to 3 hours post-exposure suggests absorbed doses in excess of 200 Röntgens. Prognosis guarded. The hospital initiated supportive care, intravenous fluids to maintain hydration, antiemetics to control vomiting, isolation protocols to reduce infection risk. Radiation destroys bone marrow, the tissue that produces white blood cells essential for fighting infection. Within days, the patients would become immunocompromised, vulnerable to bacteria and fungi that healthy immune systems easily control. The Yugoslav government, informed of the criticality at noon, made an immediate decision: request international assistance. At 1500 hours, the Foreign Ministry sent telegrams to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, the Soviet Ministry of Medium Machine Building, responsible for nuclear programs, and the United States Atomic Energy Commission. The message was brief. Criticality accident at Yugoslav research facility, 6 workers exposed, doses unknown but suspected high, requesting medical expertise and supplies. The Soviet response arrived first. By 1700 hours, Moscow had dispatched a team of 3 specialists, a hematologist experienced in treating radiation casualties, a health physicist trained in dosimetric reconstruction, and a nuclear safety engineer to investigate the accident cause. They would arrive in Belgrade by military aircraft the following morning. The IAEA response came through official channels: offer of technical support, request for detailed accident report, proposal to send safety review team. The United States, through the American Embassy in Belgrade, offered medical supplies and consultation via telegram communication with radiation medicine specialists. By 1800 hours, 7.5 hours post-accident, the second blood samples showed the first clear evidence of radiation damage. Savanovic's lymphocyte count had dropped from 2,000 cells per cubic millimeter to 1,500. Roksandich had fallen to 1,400. Majic showed a similar decline. The 3 men with lower estimated exposures, Iliev, Tanaskovic, and Kozacharnin, showed smaller but measurable decreases. Đurić understood what the numbers meant. Over the next 72 hours, these counts would continue falling, potentially reaching near zero levels in the most heavily exposed patients. Without functional immune systems, infection would become inevitable. The Soviet medical team arrived at Belgrade Airport at 0800 hours on 16th October, less than 24 hours after the accident. Dr. Angelina Guskova, the team leader, had treated dozens of radiation casualties following accidents at Soviet nuclear facilities, including several criticality incidents. Her expertise would prove essential in managing the Vinča cases. Guskova met with Kidrič at the Military Medical Academy at 0930. After reviewing medical records and examining the patients, she provided preliminary dose estimates based on clinical symptoms. Zdravko Savanović, 400 to 430 Roentgens whole-body exposure. Onset of vomiting at 2 hours post-exposure, severe nausea, falling lymphocyte counts. Prognosis, critical. Bone marrow transplantation may be necessary. Dusan Roksandich, 360 to 400 Roentgens. Clinical presentation similar to Savanović, but slightly less severe. Prognosis, critical. Milan Majic, 320 to 360 Roentgens. Vomiting onset at 3 hours, significant but slower lymphocyte decline. Prognosis, serious. Jivogin Iliev, 240 to 280 Roentgens. Mild nausea, moderate lymphocyte depression. Prognosis, guarded but favorable. Dragul Jub Tanasković, 200 to 220 Roentgens. Minimal symptoms, lymphocyte count declining but not critically. Prognosis, favorable. Radivoy Kozarchanin, 160 to 180 Roentgens. Mild symptoms, lymphocyte count stable. Prognosis, good. These estimates aligned with the men's positions relative to the heavy water tank during the criticality. Savanović and Roksandich, standing closest, received the highest doses. Kozarchanin, near the doorway 3 meters distant, received the lowest. Guskova also brought critical medical supplies from Moscow: granulocyte growth factors to stimulate white blood cell production, broad-spectrum antibiotics to combat infection, blood products for transfusion. The Soviet Union's experience with radiation accidents had generated a stockpile of specialized medications unavailable in Yugoslavia. The health physicist on the Soviet team, Igor Kochetkov, began dosimetric reconstruction, the process of calculating actual radiation doses received by each victim using physical evidence. He requested all metal objects the men had carried: watches, belt buckles, keys, coins, pens. Neutron radiation activates certain isotopes in metals, creating measurable radioactivity proportional to neutron flux. By analyzing these objects in a gamma spectrometry laboratory, Kochetkov could estimate the neutron dose component, typically about half the total dose in a criticality accident, with gamma rays comprising the other half. Results from neutron activation analysis, completed on 18th October, confirmed Guskova's clinical estimates. Savanović had received approximately 420 rad. Rads, the absorbed dose unit, roughly equivalent to Roentgens for gamma and neutron radiation. Roksandich, 380 rad. Majic, 340 rad. The three others ranged from 170 to 260 rad. For context, 50 rad represents the threshold for measurable blood changes. 150 rad causes nausea and temporary blood cell depression in most people. 300 rad is lethal to approximately half of exposed individuals without medical intervention, the so-called LD50 dose. 400 rad is lethal to the majority without aggressive treatment, including bone marrow replacement. Savanović and Roksandich had received doses well into the lethal range. Their survival depended entirely on the quality of medical care over the next weeks. By 20th October, 5 days post-accident, the clinical picture had become clear. The three most heavily exposed patients, Savanović, Roksandich, and Majic, were deteriorating rapidly. White blood cell counts had plummeted to critically low levels. Savanovic's white count measured 300 cells per cubic millimeter, down from a normal 7,000. His lymphocyte count, functionally zero. Without white blood cells, the body cannot fight infection. Bacteria that normally live harmlessly on skin and in the digestive tract become deadly invaders. Fungi that pose no threat to healthy individuals colonize lungs and bloodstream. The patients were placed in reverse isolation. Visitors wore masks and gowns, hands scrubbed with antiseptic, all food sterilized, air filtered. Despite precautions, infections began. Savanovic developed pneumonia on 22nd October. Chest X-rays showed infiltrates in both lungs. Sputum cultures grew Pseudomonas aeruginosa, a bacterium commonly found in hospitals and notoriously difficult to treat. High-dose antibiotics were administered intravenously: penicillin, streptomycin, chloramphenicol, the best available in 1958. Roxandic's condition followed a similar trajectory: falling blood counts, fever developing on 24th October, bacterial sepsis confirmed by blood cultures. Majic, with slightly lower exposure, deteriorated more slowly but still showed profound marrow suppression. The three patients with moderate exposures, Iliev, Tanaskovic and Kozarchanin, showed more favourable courses. Their lymphocyte counts bottomed out in the range of 500 to 800 per cubic millimetre, low but not absent. They remained weak, nauseated, fatigued, but did not develop life-threatening infections. Supportive care, fluids, nutrition, rest sufficed for their recovery. Guskova proposed bone marrow transplantation for Savanovic. The procedure, experimental in 1958, involved extracting healthy bone marrow from a donor and infusing it into the patient, hoping the donor cells would engraft and restore blood cell production. The Soviet Union had attempted this procedure in several radiation accident cases, with mixed results. The challenge: finding a suitable donor. Bone marrow transplantation requires close tissue matching between donor and recipient to prevent graft rejection and graft versus host disease, a condition where donor immune cells attack the recipient's body. Ideal donors are siblings with matching tissue types. Savanovic had two brothers. Tissue typing, primitive by modern standards but available, showed one brother, Borisov, had compatible antigens. On 26th October, Borisov Savanovic was admitted to the Military Medical Academy. On 27th October, surgeons performed the marrow extraction, multiple aspirations from Borisov's hip bones, yielding approximately 200 millilitres of marrow suspension containing billions of stem cells. That evening, the marrow was infused intravenously into Zdravko Savanovic over a 3-hour period. The procedure itself is straightforward, essentially a specialized blood transfusion. The critical phase comes afterward. Will the donor cells migrate to the recipient's bone marrow spaces, establish themselves, and begin producing blood cells? Or will they fail to engraft, leaving the patient still without functioning marrow? The answer typically becomes clear in 10 to 14 days. If engraftment succeeds, blood cell counts begin rising. If it fails, counts remain near zero. The medical team could only wait, maintain supportive care, and hope. While the medical drama unfolded in Belgrade, investigators worked at Vinča to understand what had gone wrong. The Federal Nuclear Energy Commission formed an accident investigation panel, including Yugoslav engineers, Soviet nuclear safety specialists, and representatives from the IAEA. The panel's mandate: determine the technical cause, identify contributing factors, and recommend measures to prevent recurrence. The heavy water laboratory remained sealed for 48 hours after the accident, while radiation levels decreased. On 17th October, investigators in protective equipment entered the room. The aluminum tank still contained heavy water and uranium rods, now at background temperature. Portable survey meters showed elevated radiation in the immediate vicinity, approximately 50 milliroentgens per hour at the tank surface, declining to near background levels 2 meters away. The residual radiation came from short-lived fission products and activated materials in the assembly. Investigators carefully documented the configuration: rod positions, heavy water level, control rod insertion depths. They photographed every detail, measured dimensions, and recorded instrument readings. The fuel rods were removed one by one and transferred to secure storage. The heavy water was drained into shielded containers. The technical investigation revealed the accident's cause: a combination of factors that individually posed limited risk, but together created a critical configuration. First, the uranium lattice geometry had been changed the previous afternoon without full recalculation of neutron multiplication factors. The new arrangement placed rods closer together, increasing neutron coupling efficiency. The calculations performed before the reconfiguration underestimated the multiplication factor. The actual value was approximately 0.99 rather than the predicted 0.98. Second, The heavy water level was slightly higher than protocol specified. Records show the tank was filled to 120 centimetres. Procedures called for 115 centimetres. The additional 5 centimetres of moderator increased neutron thermalization, further raising the multiplication factor. Third, control rod positioning was uncertain. The control rods had been fully inserted according to protocol, but the insertion depth mechanism had not been recently calibrated. Post-accident inspections suggested one control rod may have been 10 to 15 centimetres higher than operators believed, still inserted, but not fully. These three factors combined to place the assembly much closer to criticality than anyone realized. When Savanovic began withdrawing the first control rod, the assembly went prompt critical within seconds, much faster than the expected smooth approach to criticality. The investigation concluded, the accident resulted from inadequate safety margins in subcritical experiment procedures, insufficient neutronics calculations before geometry changes, and equipment maintenance deficiencies. Individual operator performance during the accident was appropriate given the circumstances. However, the procedures and administrative controls were inadequate to prevent a predictable accident sequence. Recommendations included mandatory full neutronics calculations before any lattice geometry changes, installation of automatic scram systems in the heavy water laboratory triggered by neutron flux thresholds, reduction of allowable multiplication factors in subcritical experiments from 0.98 to 0.95, improved control, rod position indication and calibration procedures, enhanced operator training in criticality safety. The report noted, this accident was preventable. The lessons learned must inform all future subcritical experimentation. The 2 weeks following Savanovic's bone marrow transplant represented the most critical period. His white blood cell count remained near zero. Fever persisted despite massive antibiotic doses. Pneumonia worsened. Chest X-rays on 2nd November showed extensive infiltrates throughout both lungs. He required supplemental oxygen delivered by mask. His brother's marrow cells, infused on 27th October, were somewhere in his body. But were they establishing themselves in the bone marrow spaces, or were they being rejected by residual immune cells? The transplant's success or failure would determine whether Savanovic lived or died. On 6th November, 10 days post-transplant, the first encouraging sign appeared. A peripheral blood smear examined under microscope showed a handful of young neutrophils, immature white blood cells indicating new production. The absolute count remained critically low, under 500 per cubic millimetre, but the presence of any new cells suggested engraftment might be occurring. Over the following week, counts rose gradually. 700 per cubic millimetre on 8th November, 1,000 on 10th November, 1,500 on 12th November, still far below normal but trending in the right direction. Fever began subsiding. Chest X-rays showed gradual clearing of the pneumonia. Oxygen requirements decreased. By 20th November, 3 weeks post-transplant, Savanovic's white blood cell count reached 3,000. Below normal, but sufficient for basic immune function. The transplant had succeeded. His brother's bone marrow had engrafted, established residence in Savanovic's bones, and begun producing blood cells. He would survive. Roksandich followed a different course. He did not receive bone marrow transplantation. Tissue typing with his siblings showed no good matches. Instead, he received the best supportive care available: antibiotics, blood transfusions, isolation precautions. His lymphocyte count remained near zero through most of November. Bacterial infections cycled, pneumonia cleared with antibiotics, only to be replaced by urinary tract infection, then skin infections, then fungal colonization of the throat. On 18th November, his condition deteriorated sharply. Blood pressure dropped. Fever spiked to 40 degrees Celsius. Blood cultures grew multiple bacterial species, a sign of overwhelming sepsis. Despite aggressive treatment, his organs began failing. Kidneys stopped producing urine. Liver function test worsened. Lungs filled with fluid. Dusan Roksandich died on 20th November 1958, 36 days after the criticality accident. The cause of death: multiple organ failure secondary to radiation-induced bone marrow aplasia and bacterial sepsis. He was 29 years old. His death marked a turning point in the medical management. The other critically exposed patient, Milan Majic, received immediate bone marrow transplantation from a matched sibling donor on 22nd November. Like Savanovic, Majic's transplant succeeded, slowly with complications, but ultimately he recovered functional bone marrow and survived. The three patients with moderate exposures, Iliev, Tanaskovic, and Kozachanin, all recovered without transplantation. Their bone marrow, damaged but not destroyed, regenerated over weeks. By mid-December, their blood counts had returned to near normal levels. They were discharged from hospital in late December, advised to return for periodic monitoring. Of the 6 men exposed in the Vinča criticality accident, 5 survived. 1 died. The margin between survival and death, approximately 60 rad of radiation dose. The Vinča accident reverberated through the international nuclear community. In December 1958, the IAEA convened a safety review meeting in Vienna, attended by representatives from 23 countries operating research reactors or planning nuclear programs. The Yugoslav delegation presented a comprehensive report on the accident, technical causes, medical management, lessons learned. The meeting's conclusions emphasized several themes. First, subcritical experiments, despite the name, carried inherent criticality risk. The distinction between subcritical and critical could disappear in seconds with small configuration changes. Every facility conducting such experiments needed robust safety protocols, conservative multiplication limits, automatic shutdown systems, remote operation where possible. Second, medical preparedness for radiation accidents required specialized expertise and equipment that most facilities lacked. The Yugoslav government's rapid engagement of Soviet specialists likely saved lives. The IAEA should facilitate international medical assistance networks for radiation emergencies. Third, criticality accidents, though rare, had occurred at multiple facilities: Los Alamos in the United States, twice in 1945 and 1946, Oak Ridge in 1958, just months before Vinča, and several incidents in the Soviet Union, details classified but outcomes known. Each accident revealed similar patterns: inadequate safety margins, procedural violations or errors, rapid escalation beyond operator control. The nuclear industry needed systematic sharing of accident information to prevent repeated mistakes. The IAEA initiated several programs following the Vienna meeting. Safety Series Report Number 7, published in 1960, documented all known criticality accidents, including detailed technical analysis of Vinča. The report was distributed to every nuclear facility worldwide, translated into multiple languages, and incorporated into operator training programs. The IAEA also established the International Nuclear Event Scale, a framework for classifying and reporting nuclear incidents from minor anomalies to major accidents. Vinča would have been classified as a Level 4 event, accident with local consequences, defined by significant radiation exposure to workers, but no off-site contamination or public exposure. In Yugoslavia, the accident prompted comprehensive reform of nuclear safety practices. The Federal Nuclear Energy Commission issued new regulations in January 1959. All subcritical experiments required prior approval from a safety review committee. Multiplication factors were limited to 0.95 maximum. Remote control systems became mandatory for critical assemblies. Operator training programs were expanded to include detailed criticality accident case studies. And health physics staff were increased at all nuclear facilities. The RA reactor resumed operations in March 1959 after safety upgrades including improved instrumentation, enhanced operator training, and revised procedures. The heavy water laboratory remained closed until June 1959, reopening only after installation of automatic neutron flux monitors with scram capability, systems that would shut down experiments immediately if neutron levels exceeded predetermined thresholds. The Vinča facility itself continued operating as Yugoslavia's primary nuclear research center through the 1960s and 70s. The RA reactor underwent several upgrades and eventually achieved 10 megawatts thermal output. By the 1980s, Yugoslavia operated 2 research reactors at Vinča, plus a small nuclear power reactor at Krško, built with American technology. But the criticality accident of October 1958 remained a defining event in Yugoslav nuclear history. Every operator trained at Vinča after 1959 learned the details: the 6 men, the heavy water tank, the blue flash, the hospitalization, Roxandich's death. The lesson was clear and permanent. Subcritical does not mean safe. Margins matter. Procedures exist for reasons written in human cost. The 5 survivors of the Vinča criticality faced lifelong medical consequences. Savanović and Majić, the bone marrow transplant recipients, required ongoing monitoring. Their transplanted marrow produced blood cells, but the cells carried their brother's genetics, not their own. This created a permanent chimeric state. Each man was a mixture of his original tissues and his brother's blood-forming cells. Periodic blood tests through the 1960s confirmed continued engraftment. Chromosome analysis of white blood cells showed the donor patterns, proving the transplanted cells remained dominant in blood production. This represented medical success. The transplants had taken permanently, but also meant ongoing immune system monitoring for potential complications. Both men experienced recurrent infections. Through the early 1960s, their immune systems, rebuilt from donor marrow, functioned but not with the robustness of undamaged systems. Respiratory infections occurred more frequently than in age-matched controls. Wound healing was slower. Vaccination responses were blunted, but these represented manageable chronic effects, not life-threatening conditions. Iliev, Tanaskovich, and Kozarchanin, the moderately exposed survivors, recovered more completely. Their own bone marrow regenerated within months. Blood counts normalized by mid-1959 and remained stable thereafter. Periodic examinations through 1965 showed no significant radiation-related health problems. They returned to work at Vinča, though not in the heavy water laboratory. None of the 5 survivors participated in further subcritical experiments. They were reassigned to reactor operations, health physics, or administrative roles, positions that did not involve direct handling of fissile materials in experimental configurations. The question of long-term cancer risk remained open. Radiation exposure increases cancer incidence, particularly leukemia and solid tumours, with latency periods of 5 to 40 years. Medical surveillance programs track the survivors through annual examinations, blood work, and cancer screening. Through 1965, 7 years post-accident, no cancers had been diagnosed in any of the 5 men, but the elevated risk would persist throughout their lifetimes. Roxandich's family received state compensation and recognition of his death as occurring in the line of duty. He was buried in Belgrade with military honours, his gravestone noting his service to Yugoslav science. His name appeared on a memorial plaque installed at the Vinča Institute in 1960, commemorating those who had contributed to the nation's nuclear program. The accident's psychiatric effects were less documented, but significant. Savanović later described persistent anxiety when working near radiation sources, hypervigilance about dosimeter readings, and intrusive memories of the blue flash. These symptoms, consistent with post-traumatic stress, were not formally recognized or treated in 1950s medical practice, but they shaped the survivors' experience nonetheless. By 1965, the 5 survivors had collectively returned to relatively normal lives. They worked, married, had children. Medical examinations showed the children had no radiation-related abnormalities. The germline damage that many had feared did not manifest in the next generation, at least not in detectable forms with 1960s diagnostic capabilities. But each man carried the permanent knowledge. They had stood at the boundary between routine experiment and lethal accident. They had seen the blue flash. One of their colleagues had died. They had survived, but survival came with costs: medical, psychological, existential. The heavy water laboratory, where the criticality occurred, operated for 33 years after the accident, finally closing in 1992 as Yugoslavia dissolved into successor states. The RA reactor itself operated until 2002, when it was permanently shut down after 46 years of service. During its operational lifetime, the heavy water laboratory hosted hundreds of subcritical experiments, all conducted under the enhanced safety protocols implemented after 1958. No further criticality accidents occurred at Vinča. The automatic scram systems installed in 1959, the conservative multiplication limits, the mandatory safety reviews, these measures worked. The accident had genuinely reformed practice. Decommissioning the facility required careful handling of residual radioactivity. Decades of neutron irradiation had activated structural materials, aluminum tanks, concrete floors, steel fixtures. These materials contained long-lived isotopes, cobalt-60, europium-152, cesium-37, requiring secure disposal. The heavy water itself, valuable and expensive, was drained and stored for potential future use or sale. The specific aluminum tank involved in the 1958 criticality had been removed from service in 1972 and stored in a shielded warehouse. Radiation surveys showed activity levels declining with the half-lives of fission products and activation products, but the tank remained too contaminated for unrestricted release. In 1994, it was cut into sections and packaged in concrete-lined steel drums for disposal in Serbia's low-level radioactive waste storage facility. Zdravko Savanovic died in 1987 at age 61. The cause of death, heart disease, not uncommon in a man his age. Whether radiation exposure contributed remains uncertain. Cardiovascular effects of radiation became recognized only in later decades, and distinguishing radiation-induced disease from natural disease in a single individual is impossible. He lived 29 years after the criticality, saw his children grow to adulthood, and retired from Vinča in 1983. Milan Majic lived longer, dying in 1998 at age 67, also from cardiovascular disease. He had worked at Vinča until retirement in 1988, ultimately serving as deputy director of the health physics department. Živojin Iliev, Dragoljub Tanaskovic, and Radivoj Kozarchanin all lived into the 21st century. Iliev died in 2009 at age 86. Tanaskovic and Kozarchanin were still living as of 2010, in their 70s and 80s respectively, when medical follow-up studies concluded. None of the 5 survivors developed leukemia, the cancer most strongly associated with radiation exposure. 2 developed solid tumours in later life, Savanovic, prostate cancer diagnosed in 1985, Majic, lung cancer diagnosed in 1996, but both cancers occurred at ages and in patterns consistent with background incidents. Attribution to the 1958 exposure remains speculative. The Vinča Institute itself continues operating as of 2025, though its role has shifted from active nuclear research to managing radioactive waste legacy and conducting environmental monitoring. The Vinča criticality accident of October 15, 1958, occupies a specific place in nuclear safety history. It was not the first criticality accident. Los Alamos had experienced 2 fatal incidents in the 1940s. It was not the largest in terms of energy release. Later accidents at processing facilities would exceed the Vinča burst by orders of magnitude. It was not the deadliest. Other accidents would claim multiple lives. But Vinča demonstrated several principles that became foundational in nuclear safety culture. First, the importance of safety margins. The difference between a successful experiment and a fatal accident, measured in centimeters of control rod position, and a few % in neutron multiplication. Conservative limits exist not to prevent routine operation, but to prevent the unexpected. Second, the value of rapid international cooperation in radiation emergencies. Soviet medical expertise provided within hours of the accident directly saved lives. No nation's nuclear program, regardless of size or sophistication, can maintain comprehensive radiation medicine capability domestically. Networks matter. Third, the necessity of transparent accident reporting. Yugoslavia's willingness to share detailed information about the Vinča accident, despite potential embarrassment, allowed the global nuclear community to learn from the event. Facilities worldwide modified procedures based on Yugoslav experience. Openness prevented repeated mistakes elsewhere. Fourth, the human dimension of nuclear safety. 6 men walked into a laboratory on an ordinary Tuesday morning, followed standard procedures as they understood them, and in 90 seconds found themselves fatally exposed. 5 survived through medical intervention that pushed the boundaries of 1950s medicine. 1 did not. The difference was not heroism or cowardice, luck or fate. It was radiation dose, measured in rads, determined by geometry and distance. The Vinci case appears in every criticality safety training course taught worldwide. Operators learn the specifics: heavy water, natural uranium, control rod positions, neutron multiplication. They see the photographs, the laboratory, the tank, the hospital rooms. They review the dose estimates and medical outcomes. They study the investigation findings and the procedural changes that followed. The lesson is not that nuclear technology is inherently dangerous. Millions of successful experiments and reactor operations demonstrate otherwise. The lesson is that nuclear technology demands rigorous adherence to procedures developed through hard experience. Those procedures exist because 6 men stood too close to a critical assembly on a morning in 1958. 1 paid with his life. 5 survived to bear witness. A small plaque hangs in the entrance hall of the Vinci Institute of Nuclear Sciences, installed in 1960. The plaque lists names of staff members who contributed significantly to Yugoslav nuclear science. Among them, Dusan Roksandic, 1929 to 1958. Visitors rarely pause at the plaque. It appears administrative, commemorative in a bureaucratic sense, lacking the drama of monuments or memorials. But the date tells the story to those who know. 29 years old, died in 1958 at a nuclear research institute. The circumstances are unmistakable. In 2018, on the 60th anniversary of the accident, the institute held a small ceremony. A handful of attendees included family members of the 6 men involved. Savanovic's daughter, now in her 60s, attended. Roksandic's nephew represented his family. Current institute staff presented a historical review: the accident, the medical response, the safety reforms, the legacy. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence and the unveiling of an updated informational display near the original plaque. The display includes photographs from 1958, the heavy water laboratory, the RA reactor, the 6 men in their laboratory coats before the accident. It includes basic technical information about what occurred and why. It includes a quote from the 1958 IAEA report: "This accident was preventable. The lessons learned must inform all future subcritical experimentation." The display makes no attempt at drama or sentiment. It presents facts: date, place, people, doses, outcomes, changes implemented. Documentary in tone, respectful in presentation, educational in purpose. The heavy water laboratory building, empty since decommissioning in 1992, still stands at the Vinci site. Radiation levels inside are now at background. Decades of decay have eliminated the short-lived isotopes, and the longer-lived contaminants were removed during decontamination. The building awaits eventual demolition or conversion to other use, but the room itself remains recognizable: concrete floor with anchor bolt holes where the aluminum tank once stood, wall-mounted cable trays that carried detector signals, a faded radiation warning symbol on the entry door. An ordinary room, a Tuesday morning, 6 men, 90 seconds. The numbers remember what memory fades.